Congressman Crenshaw, good to see you again.
Hey, UCT Ryan.
I was looking at our previous podcast, which, believe it or not, was a year ago last week. So it's been a year since we had this conversation, and a lot has transpired in the past year, not for the better.
Yeah, yeah, you better believe it. That's true. I don't even remember what we talked about last time. Probably all sorts of things.
Oh yeah.
But
Oh yeah. My question is, how do you prioritize everything that's going on and everything that needs to be addressed? Because it seems like there's just so much that needs to be tackled. And how do you focus on where you should put your energy?
well, okay. So just generally speaking, in politics, you've got like a couple of buckets or lines of effort in military speak.
Hmm.
Um, and there are probably two main ones, right? Your official side and your campaign side. Um, and obviously, there's a lot of overlap between the two. But your political campaign side, that's getting reelected. You can't do any of the policy stuff if you don't actually get reelected. And so there's a whole team that you hire separately with campaign funds that you raise just for that. And then on the official side, which is technically your real job, which frankly most politicians don't get to do a whole lot of because of the way our system is set up. We can get into that as much as you want, why that is necessarily. But that's your legislative side. So every member of Congress should pick probably a couple majors and a couple minors. That's how I would describe it. It really is. It's funny, like there's a lot of sort of university speak when you come up here. You come up here for freshman orientation, then you're in the sophomore class, and in the next session. And like I said, you should and you get separated into different committees, which is for all intents and purposes a major and maybe a minor. So mine were energy and healthcare, and that's not usually what people think it would be, but it is. I've sort of like triple, quadrupled majored in many ways. Because I do the energy stuff, I do the environmental stuff, I do the healthcare stuff as well. That's really my committee work on energy and commerce. But I also do a lot of national security issues as well, especially border security, homeland security. So this is how I prioritize. I mean, like I've got ideas on education policy as well, and I have a kind of a shallow knowledge of say like what financial services does on that committee. No one person can do it all, nor should they, because then you
Right.
just have a lot of people who know almost nothing. And so the way things generally work up here is you trust certain members just based on their backgrounds, based on their philosophies, to work on the real hard details on a certain bill in a certain committee, and you're giving them a lot of trust to a certain extent. And there's because of how complicated a lot of these issues are. That's sort of how you do it. And so I took energy and healthcare because those are important to my district. They're important to the Republican Party. It's important for us to have better angles on that, better communication styles on those particular issues. And so I gravitated towards those.
Yeah, I was looking at it because I wrote these down. Your permittees, or excuse me, committees, not permittees. I'm thinking about my moose hunt. They're talking about permittees and sub permittees, so that's where that came
Huh.
from.
I've never heard of that.
Yeah,
I've never gone.
yeah. You
Yeah.
have a permittee, and then my son, my 14-year-old, is my sub permittee. So I was thinking about hunting moose. So that's where where I'm getting that stuff from.
Committee. I see.
Yes,
Okay.
committee. Uh, anyway, so you're on energy and commerce and then as a committee is
We're gonna get there.
environmental and climate change, which is interesting because you're right. I don't typically think about that when it comes to the conservative or Republican Party, but I can see how it's so important since it seems to me the narrative is being driven by the left on a couple of these key issues that you're intimately familiar with and working on.
Right. Exactly. I mean, you wouldn't believe how many dumb people on the right got mad at me because I went to this UN climate change conference last year, and I'm going again this year. I'll go every year because you need a different perspective at these events. And there's a tendency, especially mostly on the far, angry, like kind of young online right. Like you're not even supposed to talk to Democrats. You're just supposed to really hate them and then fight like they do. None of this means anything. These are all kind of meaningless phrases and words and sound bites, but it's also extremely counterproductive. And it also tells me that you don't really want to win. So you do have to be in their playing field a little bit. Now, keep in mind too, the name of that subcommittee, the Environmental Policy and Subcommittee and Climate Change Subcommittee, will probably change the name. We won't we won't call it when we take over, assuming we win the majority. We won't call it that climate change subcommittee because it's a very loaded word and it kind of annoys people. But it doesn't mean we're going to change how we talk about climate change, which is from a very reasonable perspective, right? I don't deny climate change is happening. I don't take that route. We can talk about energy in more depth if you want. But I basically take a rational environmentalist approach, and I think that's a really catching on amongst Republican circles and certainly amongst independent circles because independents are just looking for a more rational approach to this stuff. Like they believe there's a problem, they don't believe AOC that we're going to die in 12 years. So
Right.
where's the middle ground there? And we can offer them that without hurting our energy industry.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about that even myself. You're not supposed to, right, as a conservative, and everybody knows that I am because I've been outspoken about that. But yeah, I mean, we can acknowledge that the climate is changing. We can acknowledge. I think about sustainable energy, for example, and renewable energy. Why wouldn't we want that? I just want to make sure that that it is actually renewable, that it is actually feasible and possible, and that's not going to create more harm than good. But why wouldn't we explore those options if they're there and try to create some better alternatives than what is currently available? That doesn't seem like it should be uh, taboo in the conservative world.
It shouldn't be, but look, this gets to a much bigger problem, Ryan, in the conservative world, which is rank contrarianism just for the sake of contrarianism.
Mm,
And that's not driven by principle. That's just driven by like, you know what? Most of the people are thinking this way, so I'm going to be the cool guy and think something different. But that's not driven by any sort of principle. It's not anchored in anything. It's not anchored in any kind of intellectual philosophy. It's just rank contrarianism, and I see it all the time on a ton of issues. This being one of them. Don't agree with the left. Don't do anything. Well, don't you like? Do you know understand anything about about gamesmanship, about strategy? Like it is about that give and take. It is about that 4D chess. And what we can do on the energy question in particular is really suck them in because it's like, okay, climate change is happening. And you know what? I accept everything the UN climate report says. The thing is nobody's ever read it. It's 4,000 pages of scientific jargon, and it's actually decent science. You talk to any of the skeptics, like the people everybody on the right loves, like Steve Koonin, who goes on Joe Rogan and kind of debunks all these climate change myths. Michael Schellenberger, Bjorn Lomborg, none of them say that the UN climate report is hogwash. None of them. We just actually read it, and when you read it, it turns out it's actually decent science, and it says something really important. And I think here's my favorite fact piece of data from it, which is probably the most important for policymakers because the question is, what's the cost of climate change? That's the real question. What is the cost, and what costs are we willing to incur in order to mitigate that cost? Just simple cost benefit analysis. And so when you look at the cost of climate change, there is a cost. It is largely man-made, as according to them. It doesn't really matter, frankly, for our purposes, like who to blame. The point is there's an element of CO2 production in the atmosphere that does cause it. But the cost is like 4.5% of global GDP. And so what do I mean by that? I don't mean 4.5% lower than what we currently have. That would actually be pretty devastating if that were true. What I mean is in by the year 2100, you'll have 4.5% less global GDP than you otherwise would. So global GDP is on a trajectory upward. It always is. We're in a down spot right now, but it'll keep going up and up and up.
right.
By the year 2100, estimates are like 450% increase. So that's the average estimate increase. With climate change, you got about a 434% increase. So it's a cost. It's just a very small one compared to, say, what AOC is saying. So with that knowledge, and if that's the scientific consensus, fine. Now let's attribute solutions accordingly that don't cost us more than that. Let's start there.
Right.
Our solution shouldn't cost more than that in terms of, especially in terms of human flourishing. And that's actually a harder to define metric. Like, what is human flourishing? And I would define human flourishing as like, what people in Africa can turn on their freaking stove instead of killing themselves indoors because they're burning wood and dung to heat their lamps. While the UN is telling them that they need solar panels, which they don't even have a grid. So I mean, it's really rational environmentalism is the conservative doctrine because it says, look, all of the above energy, solar where it makes sense, wind where it makes sense. It does make sense in West Texas. It doesn't make sense to overpopulate the grid with unreliable energy to the detriment of investment in more reliable forms of energy like gas and nuclear. Okay, so that's where the balance comes in. That's where the rational environmentalism comes in.
Yeah, it seems to me that so many people just want to score these virtue points or signal to their constituents that, hey, we're doing something about it. Isn't that the rallying cry is do something, do anything? It's like, well, hold on, hold on. Like, we want to
Yeah,
make sure that what you're proposing, although, yes, is doing something, is actually going to move the needle in the right direction. But I
yeah.
think that's why we elect people is we at the root is like, well, if I elect Congressman Crenshaw, he's going to do something. It's like, well, okay,
Do
so is
what?
that
Yeah.
exactly right? But we never evaluate that. We think, okay, he's conservative, this person's liberal, and so they're probably going to vote or institute policy that's based on that side of the aisle, and so I feel good about that. It's just not enough.
Yeah, and well, look, the action oriented governing philosophy is that's a very left wing idea. Lately, it's become a right wing one as well. Now, there's a difference between right wing and conservatism. All right, right wing populism, to my mind, is very similar to liberalism in the sense that they're very action oriented, especially when it comes to domestic policy and kind of this lurch towards industrial policy. Like it always sounds good at first, but when you kind of start to break apart the layers, it's hard to find examples of it working very well. But there's a temptation because people are naturally inclined, left or right, to believe in that action and believe that action holds some kind of virtue, no matter what the action is.
Mm-hmm.
The nature of conservatism it's really the only proper governing philosophy because it says, look, conservatism isn't necessarily about the outcomes. So that's where a lot of people get wrong. That's what right wingers get wrong. Right wingers have a list of outcomes they think we should have, and then they just rally around that. Like they have no idea what the underlying philosophy is behind those outcomes.
Mm.
It's more about a team sport with a lot of these folks, especially young ones, especially online. I call them the woke right for a bunch of reasons, and yeah, because it's all just feelings. It's all feelings, and it becomes these kind of idiosyncratic loyalty tests where it's like if you're not 100% on this, then it's like hold the hell on. Conservatism is about the process by which we got there. Right? It's about
Right.
the process of action. And so we believe in limiting principles and in thinking through certain questions like, does this infringe overly on individual rights? Does it infringe on states' rights? Should this even be solved at a state level? Maybe it should be solved at a community level. Those are really basic conservative questions. Is it affordable over the long run? Does our tax and spend balance out? These are the basic process oriented conservative questions. Now, there's a very high likelihood that they do end up in certain outcomes that we all tend to agree upon. I mean, that's basically how we've seen conservatism develop over the course of decades. But what I fear is the people who didn't understand that history to begin with, and the first word out of their mouth every 5 seconds is rhino, because
Right.
they're the most conservative, right? And there's this just weird trend of like heretic hunting that is extremely counterproductive. And like, if we're all being honest, has nothing to do with what they care about as far as issues or policy. It has everything to do with how much attention you can get online. And
Optics.
it's just attention. It's
Right.
clickbait.
Yeah, the other thing I've wrestled with is this even just the idea of government. So many people, and I don't know this is necessarily new, but it seems to be a growing trend, believe that the government's job is outcome oriented. And I don't think it is. I think it's, hey, the government serves its purpose by leveling the playing field and making sure that we're all operating with the pursuit of liberty, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The outcome is on me. The outcome is on my community. The outcome is what I put forth or how smart I am or how dumb I am or what decisions I make. But really, it's not the government's place to secure the outcome, just level the playing field so we can go out and secure our own. Do you agree or disagree?
I do tend to agree. And again, this gets to the divide on the right because you're whatever they call themselves. I call them the woke right, but they might call themselves populist. They might call themselves nationalist conservatives. They'll say, okay, Ryan, maybe I agreed with that at one point, but we've lost our country. So now we have to
Mm,
take action. And I just can't imagine anything more dangerous because the things they're willing to do are extremely illiberal, and also very left wing. Right? They just tend to have a lot of overlap with progressives when they start talking. They want to do things like get rid of the filibuster. Like if we can just take one slim majority and take our country back. Now they say sound bites like that. They don't ever really define it. Then they'll do it. If they'll set dangerous precedents that can always come back and haunt you later, they don't care. They want to do that right now. So that, at least those are the kind of demands that they have. Now they know they'll never really win, so they'll never have the actual responsibility of being in charge and implementing a lot of these things. So it is a bit disingenuous, those criticisms from my mind. But at the same time, I think, this conversation has long been going on. I think lately it's gotten so toxic that I just dismiss it. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't something to it. And so I guess the best argument for that other side, that the government is there to have some kind of outcome. They would say that one of the goals of government is to preserve liberty and prosperity, and that it hasn't done that because it's grown so much. That's pretty hard to argue with. Like, I think that's a reasonable critique
Sure.
of this notion. But it's not even clear that we're disagreeing at that point, because maybe we would be in agreement that the government wasn't fulfilling its primary function in the first place, which was to create that level playing field, as you say, that everyone can compete in within a meritocracy, engage in personal responsibility, and achieve prosperity as a result. And so that is the rub. The other rub with conservatives is more on the religious side, that we've lost our Judeo-Christian roots in society, and that government has to be there to take that back, because our Constitution is built upon those foundations. But there's an argument there. There's an argument there. Again, though, you tread into pretty dangerous territory, depending on what your solution actually is. Depending on how far you're willing to go to use the hand of government to make what you want happen. Some good examples of this would be this abortion debate that we're having right now. So yeah, you could have if let's say we took control right now and we eliminated abortion nationwide. It would be deeply foolish to think the Democrats aren't just going to reverse that as soon as they take over. Right. So there is some benefit to this thing called the filibuster. There is some benefit to how impossible it is to pass very, very sweeping and very controversial legislation at the national level. And McConnell was getting all those calls back when we had the Senate to do away with the filibuster in Trump's first 2 years, and he resisted it, and for good reason. If he hadn't resisted it, we imagine where we'd be right now.
Yeah, where we'd be right now. Exactly.
These last couple of years of pieces of legislation coming out of the House that would then pass the Senate are devastating.
Like what specifically? I know obviously there's abortion and some of these bigger topics that are very forefront on people's mind, but what else?
Oh, that would be one. You'd have you'd have abortion on demand at all stages of life. You'd have HR1, which is a federal takeover of our elections, and basically the dismantling of all the rules surrounding our elections. I think is sometimes the best way to describe what HR1 is. You'd have HR3, drug pricing bill. Actually, crap, they got that one through in the reconciliation, unfortunately. You'd have a lot of gun bills that I'm sure your audience doesn't like. You'd have universal background checks. You'd have things like that. You probably have a gun registry, which is in a way kind of what a universal background check is.
Right. So that one's an interesting one to me, because I've purchased firearms and I've never not had a background check. I guess maybe some private sales or something like that. But it's always interesting when you talk about these background checks, because I don't know. It seems like everybody I've ever talked to goes through a background check. What's the issue? As long as it's done legally, but that's kind of the rub, isn't it? It's like, okay, well, are criminals going to do this legally? No, of course not.
And that's the question. And it's because look, there are sincere people who are like, I don't understand. You go buy a gun from a gun store and you get a background check. Why can't but you can go online and buy it from some other guy who builds ARs in his basement and you don't have to get a background check. Now, there's a lot of complications to the law there. I believe if he's selling it as if it's a business, he does have to register at a certain point. But the idea is that we're friends, and you're like, oh man, I'm not using this anymore. Dan, do you want it? That's the idea. And then the second idea, obviously that you alluded to, is what if we were criminals? Why? There's no teeth here. There's no incentive for us to actually go get a background check. So it's just not going to change anything. And if a law is going to make us feel good but not actually change anything for the better, then and it will infringe on freedoms, then that, oh my God, it's like I just went through this conservative problem solving. So it's a perfect example, because conservative outcomes were now we're against universal background checks. The problem is people don't understand why, because too many people haven't gone through the actual conservative process to get there. And again, I complain about this a lot. This is why so many people end up as right wingers instead of conservatives.
Mm. So I know a lot of people are critical of, and I want to get your take on this concept of red flag laws, and
Mm.
that's something that well, I won't preface it with anything. I'm very curious about your take on these types of policies, these type of procedures, these red flag law type things that are proposed quite often, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think we talked about it last time, and this is obviously a little boogeyman that always follows me because people
Right.
online like to use me as clickbait, and
Yeah.
it's become quite stupid. But like the only votes I've ever taken against red flag laws, I voted against them. There's some claim that we all voted for red flag laws in a military spending bill like last year, and it's not really true.
Mm.
There was already a deal struck. There was nothing like that was going to be in the bill. We all knew it. So that was a bit of a disingenuous attack. But again, if it's clickbait, people will say whatever they need to say.
And we don't know
Um,
any different, as an average person, we wouldn't know any different because we're not going to go look into it. We're not going to study and research for ourselves, and we're just going to be force fed and accept whatever media or other outlets decide to share with us.
Pretty much, and those outlets, more times than not, and this is true on the left and the right. Those outlets are their business model is driven by clicks. So, and one thing I tell conservatives all the time is I want you to imagine whatever kind of fringy website that you like, and it lists some headlines. And headline number one is like Nancy Pelosi takes trip on taxpayer dime to Italy or something like that. And
Right.
headline number two is Ilhan Omar again talks about how much she hates the Jews. All right, so that's number two. Number three, 5 reasons why Dan Crenshaw is a globalist rhino. You're like, which one are you going to click on? Which one
Yeah.
are you going to click? Of course, you're going to click on mine, right? Because it's like, oh, he's supposed to be on our side. Let's go see why he's a globalist rhino.
Right.
It's just it's pure childish clickbait. The number of conspiracies I've had to debunk about myself are really absurd at this point, and they don't even come from the left. So, they come from the right way. Again, the woke right. Um, and so anyway, back to red flag laws. The proper conservative way to think about that is okay. So you've got this idea where you don't want to infringe on everybody's rights when it comes to guns. So you take it on a case by case basis. All right. So again, this doesn't sound too bad at first. The problem becomes implementation, which is ultimately why most conservatives say, like, I'm not sure how to get here, because the problem is implementation. How do you create those standards? First of all, what what behavior what behavior reaches the point where a judge can actually confiscate your property?
Right.
And we're assuming that behavior isn't illegal yet, right? That's actually the key point, because like
Right.
if it's
They
already
haven't done anything
illegal,
illegal. Sure.
but if they've engaged, if they can be charged with harassment, if they can be charged with stalking, if they can, now you're in a different world here. Okay, now you can say, well, look, you've broken the law. Now there's going to be some consequences for that law. The thing about red flag laws, the way they're written, nobody really knows what exactly they're trying to enforce and where that standard is. So you can't enforce it, and that's ultimately why they probably won't do anything. There's this idea that they're always being abused. I haven't seen any evidence of that, but I suppose they could be in theory. There's this other idea that an ex-girlfriend can just call the police and then they'll take your guns. That's usually the soundbite that you hear. I see no evidence that that's really true either. Again, the reason to be, if you're going to make a real argument against them, the argument should be along the lines that I just said, that you run into very murky legal territory and an individual rights territory and due process territory about what constitutes that broken law that deserves some form of punishment, because confiscating property, even temporarily, is some form of punishment. Like people are very sincere when they're for these things. I mean, they're like, look, some people will say, look, I got a schizophrenic brother who has just no business having a weapon. How do you deal with that? Right. That's an honest question. And it's actually harder to answer from a policy perspective than I think many people would like to believe it is.
Yeah, well, it's not convenient to be able to have to answer those questions if you're an advocate for red flag laws, because that is a valid, those are valid concerns, is the murkiness. And then what ends up happening, I think, is you have precedent that's set through court cases and litigation, and that can be, as we know, very bad precedent. And then everything is established on that bad precedent if it's not clearly outlined what would constitute somebody having their property seized from them.
Right. Right. Exactly. And, you know, I will say, I'll give you some like elements of good news. So there was like a red flag law grant program, not a law, but a grant program passed in that big gun bill that everybody was really mad about. You know, 10 Republicans voted for it. So the Democrats got it through. If we're being honest about what that thing did, it's a grant program that actually would force states with very lax red flag laws, lax in a bad way, like lax in a way that Second Amendment members would not like.
Got it.
You know what I mean? Like it doesn't have all the due process protections. It would actually force them to use those. So, you know, and let's be honest, states that don't have red flag laws, they're not just going to suddenly put red flag laws up because you can get extra couple $1 million from the federal government. It's just not going to. I don't see why that would happen. It's not really a financial burden or decision. It's more of a policy decision. So, you know, for viewers in Texas, like, there's zero evidence that there's going to be red flag laws in Texas anytime soon because of that bill. You know, in fact, I'm not sure what restrictions, if any, I have on my guns after that bill.
Right.
So,
interesting.
So that would be I mean, yeah, somebody could name me one, but well, you can't because I know the bill pretty well. but it's a you know, it's I'm just saying, like, there's more good news than we would like to believe. Like, it's not great. I still voted against it. I still think you know, I still fall into the category of, you know, we don't want any action that could potentially infringe my Second Amendment right. But it also took the political conversation right off the table. Democrats haven't been talking about it. Like they moved on. They moved on to a different agenda. So, you know, trying to make your listeners feel slightly happier over some of these things that are passed.
Well, I think even just the way that you bring these subjects to light through your social media is powerful. And we just don't get enough of that. I know you and I have even had some, I would say, slight, maybe surface level disagreements, and then we've hashed it out a little bit via, you know, Instagram. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, that's different. I understand what you're saying now, but not everybody has that opportunity to be able to hash through this, even the slightest degree, how we have through Messenger, for example. And so it's hard because everybody just takes everything at surface level. And then to your point about the woke right and even the far left, is people just cling on to that because they want their side to win. And there's no way for us to really get a lot of the nuance that needs to be understood for the decisions that are being made on our behalf.
I mean, there is, you know, but it just takes work.
Yeah, right. True.
And you know, and it's not easy. And you know, all I ask of people is, like, take a step back. The real problem is people just jump to conclusions that are highly irrational. And, like, if you don't know about something, you don't know about something. But you don't need to have a very strong opinion about something if you don't know about something, I would think. But a lot of people do. People have very strong opinions over a subject matter which they know very little. And look, there's a lot of trust loss. I get it. I just don't see that as an excuse. You know, people can find like a few instances where legacy media lied to them. It doesn't mean they're always lying to you. Doesn't mean everything you hear is a lie. And it certainly doesn't mean that your next step should be going down to the deepest, darkest corners of the internet to, like, you know, redconspiracyelephant.com and, like, this is finally I found my news on InfoWars. Like, finally the truth. And it's like, because and there's this temptation by a lot of people to, especially men, you know, this is a man podcast, right? To gravitate towards those deep, dark corners, like to believe that the most sensational accusations and headlines are by nature true. And I'm not sure I'm not sure about the psychology behind that and why that happens, but I absolutely see it. And whereas I would say, where I see things like that and I immediately take a step back and say, like, that just doesn't sound right. There are others who do the exact opposite and say, like, finally somebody's saying it how it is. I'm like,
right.
I don't think that's what they're doing. I think they think that you'll click on it. I think that's what I think, you know, like, this stuff isn't that complicated. The business model is very simple. And it makes my life difficult because within those deep, dark, stupid websites, again, I'm a globalist that works for the World Economic Forum, according to them.
Right.
You're like, what the hell are you people even talking about? I mean, it's complete nonsense, you know, and it wastes a lot of our time politically. It wastes a ton of our time. You know, dealing with some of these issues as opposed to dealing with real issues like energy policy, pipeline permitting, things that will actually affect your life and help you. We deal with this nonsense instead.
Yeah, you got to get bogged down by all this. I think the psychology behind it, and I don't know, I haven't really thought about it much, but since you brought it up, is almost a defense mechanism or some grasp at control, right? If I think
Maybe,
this is
yeah.
probably more accurate for men, is that hey, we want to make sure we know everything that's going on so we can control situations, we know our threats, and so a lot of the times we just end up making things worse than they really are for some semblance of control over something that we have very little control over.
Right. In this case, the control would be, you know, information and just the general knowledge of your surroundings. I could see that. I could see that. Um, and I don't know. I don't know how it happens. I think we have a severe lack of critical thinking in this
Yeah.
country.
Or even just
I
humility.
Yeah, well, there you go. That's a big one actually.
I mean, I
It's the
know I've gotten
humility to
into,
know what you don't know.
right, because I've gotten into discussions and debates, even on this podcast with people that I say, hey, tell me about this because I don't agree with that, and then they explain it. I'm like, oh, okay, well that's interesting. I hadn't considered that, or I thought you meant something else, but actually you mean this, and it's been very enlightening. But I've had to have an open mind about it, which admittedly I haven't always had, and there's some areas and instances where I still am very close minded about that I need to do a better job opening up about.
Yeah, and that takes a sense of maturity and humility. And if you're looking at people who are very, very active, young, active, online, politically oriented, those two attributes are in very short supply. Humility and
Yes.
right. It's very much about like the chest thumping, name calling, you know, soundbite type of culture. And I think a lot of people just have fun with it to an extent. I think they're just like they just like being muckrakers and shit talkers online.
Yeah.
I just wish everybody understood how badly it was destroying our politics and destroying our national conversation and wasting people's time who actually have serious things to do. And that's what I wish everyone would understand, that there actually is some detriment. It might be entertaining, but there is some negative consequences to turning our politics into the Jerry Springer show. Like if
Hmm.
you're incentivizing, you know, idiots to come stalk me in person and just yell and scream and do all this crap, if you're incentivizing that with your attention and your clicks, you are destroying our political fabric. And I don't care if that person's coming from the left or the right. Doesn't matter. It's destroying our political fabric because it turns our politics into the Jerry Springer show instead of this, frankly, what should be a very boring, like process oriented, nitty gritty policy making. It should be so boring that nobody wants to pay attention to it. That's what good politics would actually, or good policy making at least, good governing would actually be. Um, and it's unfortunately not that way. You know?
Well, and it doesn't just come from the people. It also comes from our elected representatives who use social media as an opportunity to grandstand and to entertain and say things. Like AOC is a great example, to say things that I'm like, this woman
Yeah,
cannot possibly believe the things that she's saying. Like that just can't, I cannot fathom how that would be possible.
right.
And to me, it's just a bunch of grandstanding and entertaining as opposed to, like you said, policy making, legislation, the things we actually elected you guys to do.
Right. Oh, it's a chicken or the egg question. I'm not sure which came first, like the politicians willing to take advantage of it or the trends that were, you know, happening in the public. Um, but in any case, yeah, AOC opened the door, swung it wide open, and quite a few others walked through it. The worst thing I hear on the right is we need this girl to counter AOC. So we need another 25-year-old with no work experience to count. Are you kidding me? Are you
Right.
kidding me? No, we don't. We don't need any more of this, you know. And people like I got a lot of trouble like a year ago, less than a year ago, because I was talking about performance artists, and then I used an example of how the Freedom Caucus votes and how they didn't really vote with Trump, and people were super mad about that because people are very emotional, and that's fine. I wasn't really talking about the Freedom Caucus as performance artists. A couple are, but it's also important to note what we mean by performance artists and political performance. Political grandstanding and performance means dying on hills that you know are useless,
Hmm.
right? Gaining attention for no purpose whatsoever. That's the difference, because it's one thing to like entertain. I mean, I do fun videos. I do entertainment, but there's
Mm-hmm.
a reason I'm doing it. I'm trying to bring you to a better place. I'm also trying to use that kind of entertainment because the kind of entertainment I do is a little bit more fun. And what I'm doing is I'm grabbing people who might disagree with us and bringing them into the fold. So there's always method behind the madness. A lot of what worries me is newer politicians coming up and coming are more inclined to have those priorities switched, whereas the end goal is actually just more followers. The end goal is actually just that being that influencer online and doing whatever it takes to get there. There are no other end goals related to, say, policy. There's just not. Marjorie Taylor Greene doesn't write any policy. She doesn't care. I mean, she literally does not care. So, and ask yourself if that is maybe she'd make a fine activist, but she shouldn't be a member of Congress.
How do you change the public perception of that, though? Because it reminds me of Gladiator, where he's like, "Are you not entertained?" Like we all love it, right? We all thrive on it. So how do you actually educate people to the point where they think to themselves or start behaving like, "Oh no, this is important." And yes, there is a performative element of it because you're trying to influence people, but how do we get the population to think more critically about this?
I don't know. I mean, that's a tough question. I try every day. It's part of it's just explaining what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
All right. This is why I tell people how I view something like the woke right. This is why I explain the things the way I explain them, so that people, so that a light goes on in someone's head and says, I hadn't really thought about that way and what they're doing and why they're doing it. I kind of see what you're saying now. Train people to, I don't know. The thing is like there is a real problem in America with what is incentivized and what is rewarded. And I would think, again, because I'm like boring and I was always interested in policy. I was never interested in politics necessarily, but the policy. And so if I'm looking at a potential member of Congress, I'm thinking, do they actually understand these complicated issues? And will they be smart people on the Capitol Hill when they talk about them? Right. That's what I'm asking. That's just not what's necessarily rewarded, because if they can't also do the entertaining soundbite, they can't get elected.
Right.
And how do you get people to care about that? I mean, I'm not sure. I'm really not sure.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. If we could answer that, I think things would change. But that's maybe why things won't totally change, or why it might take a very, very long time, or a very painful and humbling experience to change, which would be obviously unfortunate and dangerous.
There's just been this trend towards like, we need a fighter, right? You hear that all the time. We need a fighter.
Sure. Right.
Or okay. Well, what does that mean in terms of politics? Does anyone define it? Well, I'll define it for you. A fighter should be somebody who wins, right? Maybe at least that's like the first step of fighting. If you're going to get into a fight, your goal should be to win.
Sure.
A lot of people don't want to win, because winning means responsibility after you've won. You've actually got to govern. So some people kind of talk about how they, that's why when people are like, I don't even want to go vote because my vote doesn't count, and it's because you don't want to win. Be honest, it's because you don't want to win. You'd rather be a victim. Victimhood has been elevated as a key attribute in American society, and if we think that's just happening on the left, we're crazy. It's happening everywhere. It's happening everywhere, and so winning should be the goal. And in politics, you win by persuading others to agree with you, and so maybe that's the best. Like, if I had to ask people one rhetorical question that would get them to understand what I'm talking about here, it's, does the person you like so much in politics, have they convinced anyone to see things your way? Have they ever convinced a single person to see things your way, or do they probably do the opposite? And if the answer is no, then they're probably not a very good fighter for you. They are good at fighting for your attention. That they're perfect at. Right? They're great at fundraising off of your attention and tricking you into thinking that they're a so-called fighter, but they're not, because they've never made anyone believe things that are conservative. They've never changed anybody's mind. And that is the key metric to winning in politics. So I think that's the question you have to ask your representatives.
Yeah. Well, good points. I really appreciate you coming on. I know you're a busy man. I know there's so much to talk about. We can't obviously get to it all, but I really appreciate your work and what you're doing, and even our conversations, this and shorter ones that we've had, because they have opened my eyes to seeing things a little differently. Because naturally, I tend to look at what's posted on social media and gravitate towards, oh, there's a click, there's a headline. That's true. but these nuances are so crucial, and I appreciate your time explaining them to us and helping us understand.
Yeah, Ryan. No, man, appreciate you having me on. I know we didn't get, it was mostly uh about politics. We didn't even get into a whole lot of interesting issues, but I think it's stuff people need to hear. So I appreciate you having me on.
You bet. Yeah, always willing and ready to do this. So if we ever want to do it again and get into some different politics, the actual politics or policy, I should say, then we can certainly do that as well.
Always, always.
All right.
Thanks, man.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate you.
Appreciate you too.